Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 8, and my name is Janet Szabo. I will be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I had originally thought that I might do an episode on some vintage sewing machines, especially my Neckies, but as things went on this week and I had to readjust my schedule here and there, I decided that what I'm going to talk about today is Coverstitch machines. I talked about sergers last week or 2 weeks ago, and this week I think I'm going to talk about Coverstitch machines because I'm busy getting ready for a decorative Coverstitch class. Before we jump into talking about that though, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm sewing right now. I am doing class prep for my decorative Coverstitch class. I am about to test the Style Arc Linda pants, which are a pull-on woven pant. And I have some black stretch poplin that I'm going to use for a muslin for that pattern, a smaller size. I'm also working on my Bernina Q20. I'm quilting a king-size quilt top. The pattern that I used is the Scrapper's Delight quilt from the book Sunday Morning Quilts. It's one that I have made twice before, at least twice before. King-sized version in bright colors is on our bed. This is a king-sized version in creams and whites. It is a scrappy quilt. I just grabbed all of the creams and whites in my stash and sliced and diced them into strips on my AccuQuilt cutter, and I had a friend who donated some of her stash and her leftovers to help stretch the amount of fabric that I had to use. And it ended up being a king-size quilt. I may put it on our bed, I'm not sure. My husband does concrete foundations for a living, and he tends to get kind of dirty, so I'm thinking that a cream and white quilt on our bed and my husband might not be a good match, but we'll see. I'm about halfway through quilting it. I'm using Amanda Murphy's lollipop rulers. I'm using the circle ruler and doing a string of circles across the width of the quilt. The quilt blocks are based on a log cabin pattern and they're very linear, and I thought having a circular or rounded quilting pattern would be a nice contrast, and so far it looks really nice. On the quilt that's on our bed upstairs, I did free motion loops. Free motion loops were the first free motion quilting pattern I mastered, and I have a tendency to default to that pattern because it's easy for my brain and my hands to do and it goes real quickly, but I wanted to do something a little more intricate on this quilt. We might be getting a snowstorm this week. It's hard to tell because the current forecast says that we're going to get at least rain and cooler temperatures with highs in the 40s. At one point I saw a forecast that said highs in the 30s and snow. And today I heard another forecast that said that we aren't going to get the cold weather at all, because there is some disagreement among the computer models about exactly what's going to happen. So we'll have to do what the people did 100 years ago and just wait and look out the window and find out what's happening. I've been working on my Sue Spargo Squash Squad embroidery project in the evenings. I'm just about finished with block number 2, and I'm about ready to start block number 3. I like to keep an embroidery project or an English paper piecing project handy in the evenings when my husband and I are watching YouTube videos, and that just keeps my hands occupied. I've got several classes coming up next week. On Tuesday, I'm going to be teaching a class on making Christmas gifts on the serger, and I'll be teaching that at the quilt store that is north of Kalispell. On Wednesday evening, I'm teaching a Socks on the Serger class, and I'll be teaching that at the quilt store that is south of town. That's the way I tell them apart, and that's the way I identify them for my husband, so that He doesn't have to remember the actual name of the quilt store. He just knows that I'm either north of town or south of town. So those classes are scheduled for Tuesday and Wednesday. And then next Friday, I'm driving 2 hours south of here to Missoula to teach the Bernina Serger Mastery class at A Clean Stitch. I'm really enjoying teaching, and I'm glad that my calendar is filling up with classes. I've got a couple scheduled in Spokane next month and another one scheduled in Missoula in December, and then that'll be it until after the holidays. It's about time for me to start getting my spring classes on the schedule before things start to fill up. I'm going to teach a beginning sewing class locally here at our community center in our little neighborhood. And I'll be teaching at Sew Expo. I'm going to be actually teaching knitting at Sew Expo. They do have other craft classes at Sew Expo. And that'll be February 29th to March 4th. And I'll have details both in my blog and on the show notes for this episode. So what I've been working on this week is getting some class samples ready for my decorative cover stitch class that I'm teaching the second week of November at the quilt store south of town. And that might make you wonder what a cover stitch machine is and what it does. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I went looking for a history of the cover stitch machine. The information is kind of hard to tease out. Cover stitch machines, I think, have been used in industrial applications probably for a couple of decades, but the earliest reference that I could find to a domestic cover stitch machine was, of course, on the Baby Lock website. Baby Lock has traditionally been one of the pioneers in serging and cover stitching. They were one of the first brands, I think the first brand, to come up with air threading. And they came out with the Baby Lock Evolve in 1999. And that was the first machine that was a combo serger cover stitch machine. They followed that up with the BLCS model in 2001, and that was a standalone cover stitch machine. So those were the two first mentions that I could find about cover stitch machines in the domestic market. I have had my cover stitch machine. I'm on my second cover stitch machine, and I'll explain why. I've had my cover stitch machine since about 10 years ago. I don't remember the exact date that I bought it, but I do remember that it wasn't too long after I started serging and making my own clothes, because I decided that anything worth doing is worth doing in excess, and if I was going to have a serger to make my own clothes, I probably ought to have a cover stitch machine to hem them. And that is where cover stitch machines really shine. They are traditionally and primarily used to hem fabrics, hem garments. They can be used to hem either woven garments or knit garments. I've seen them used both, but they're typically used more often to hem knit garments. You might also hear them referred to as cover hem machines. And the reason that they are called cover hem machines is because they hem and cover the raw edge of a piece of fabric simultaneously. So if you can imagine making yourself a knit top on the serger and then wanting to hem it, the cover stitch machine will let you turn up a hem. I typically do my hems about an inch deep on my knit tops. Turn up a hem, and it'll look like twin needle sewing on the front of the work, and it'll look like a covered looper stitch on the back of the work. And that's because cover stitch machines have 2, sometimes 3 needles and 1 looper. So if you were to open up a cover stitch machine, it would look very similar to a serger, except that it doesn't have a knife. And the looper thread goes back and forth between those two needles, let's say that you're doing a 2-thread cover stitch or a twin needle cover stitch, the needles form sewing stitches like you would see on a machine, but if you turn the work over on the reverse side, that looper loops back and forth between the two needles and covers the hem and keeps it from raveling. I really thought my cover stitch machine was pretty cool. The first time I saw it make a cover stitch hem, I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And I expected just to have a standalone machine to do nothing but cover stitch hems. But as time has gone on and I've learned more about them and they've become more popular in the domestic market and more information has come out about them, I have discovered that they are almost as versatile as sergers. Even though I thought my cover stitch machine was pretty slick, we did not get off on the best footing. I started out with a Janome Cover Pro 1000 CPX. That machine had a lot of problems. I suspect that Janome saw an opportunity. This is just pure speculation on my part, but I suspect that Janome saw an opportunity to move into the domestic cover stitch market and perhaps rushed a machine to market without adequately testing it or doing quality control on it or even understanding exactly what they were producing. If you had a cover stitch machine 10 years ago and you were on the internet, you may have been, as I was, part of a Facebook group for cover stitch machines, and there were posts upon posts upon posts about how to get the Janome cover stitch machines to work properly, to the point where people were advised to take the machines apart and alter the position of the feed dogs in order to get them to feed properly. That machine had a lot of problems with skipped stitches. So you'd be working along and making your cover hem and you'd get it all done and you'd turn it over and look at it, and lo and behold, there'd be 2 or 3 spots where either the thread had broken, the looper had broken, and there were skipped stitches, which just completely destroys the integrity of your hem. So I did have to take my machine apart and adjust the feed dogs. I also discovered that the recommended presser foot pressure setting was wildly incorrect. And I had the best success with my cover stitch machine when I really, really loosened the presser foot pressure. And that was validated in a post that I saw from someone who actually worked on an industrial cover stitch machine. And she said, in most cases, domestic cover stitch machines come with the presser foot pressure set way too high. So I backed mine way off, and that improved the situation somewhat, but the machine still didn't behave the way I thought it should. I had the 1000 model. Janome came out with a 2000 model, the 2000 CPX, and I don't think that there was much difference between the 1000 and the 2000 except maybe better lighting. And then a few years ago, they came out with the Janome 3000 CPX. And I actually bought another Janome cover stitch machine. And you might be saying, why would I do that if I had so many problems with the first one? And I did it because I was familiar with the machine and it appeared to me that they had worked all the bugs out. And also the 3000 CPX comes with a top cover stitch function, which not a lot of the other machines, the other models have. And I haven't yet used it, but if I ever need to, I have that capability. I have been much happier with the Janome 3000 CPX. It worked almost perfectly straight out of the box. I haven't had to adjust anything except the presser foot pressure, which I backed way off as I did on the first machine. But the 3000 behaves really, really nicely, and I'm very pleased with it. My machine is a standalone machine. All it does is cover stitch. It doesn't serge. I can do a chain stitch with it, but it is not a combo machine. A lot of manufacturers have combo machines. So Baby Lock has a combo machine or several combo machines. Bernina has the L890, which is a combo machine. And the advantage of having a combo machine is that you have 5-thread serger capabilities with the combo machine. So if you would imagine on a serger, you can do either a 3-thread serged edge or a 4-thread serged edge. A combo machine allows you to do a 5-thread stitch, and I'm going to try to explain this verbally without a picture. So on a 5-thread serger, 2 of the threads form a chain stitch. There's a needle thread and a chain looper underneath the bed of the machine. So 2 of the 5 threads are forming the chain stitch. The other 3 threads are forming a 3-thread edge on the edge of the fabric. And the best illustration of this, if you have on a pair of jeans, bend down and fold the cuff of your pants back. Fold the leg of your jeans up so that you can see the seam inside your jeans. That's a 5-thread seam. Jeans are typically constructed on a 5-thread serger, and that's because the chain stitch provides 1 seam, and the 3-thread edging both seams the fabric and overcasts the edge to keep it from fraying. So my Juki industrial 5-thread serger is not a combo machine. It is not a cover stitch machine. It is a serger, but it is a 5-thread serger, and I can do a 5-thread seam on jeans. If I wanted to construct a pair of jeans, I would probably use that machine. Combo machines that do both serging and cover stitching also can do the same stitch that my industrial Juki 5-thread serger can do, because there is a chain looper underneath the bed of the machine that works in concert with the left-hand needle. Hopefully I have not completely confused you. Some people like to have a combo machine, or maybe only have the budget for a combo machine. When I bought my Bernina serger, I chose not to go with the L890 because I already had 2 cover stitch machines. I have my original Janome 1000, and now I have my Janome 3000. I sometimes take the Janome 1000 to class if I need it. So I chose to get the Bernina L860, which is a serger only. It doesn't have any cover stitch capabilities. If you do have room for 2 machines, then you might not want a combo machine. But as I said, if you have limited space or you only have the budget for 1 machine, then a combo machine might be the way to go. They're much easier now to convert over than they used to be. Converting the Bernina L890 from serger to cover stitch function takes about 5 minutes. It's not complicated at all, and I suspect the Baby Lock combo machines aren't much different. Those are the 2 brands that I have, the brands of sergers that I have the most experience with, both because I own a Bernina serger and because I teach classes at a store that's a Baby Lock serger dealer. So I'm sure that there are other machines that fall into these categories, but I'm not going to try and talk about them because I'm not familiar with them. One of the quirks of cover stitch machines is that the looper is underneath the bed of the machine, and so if you want the looper thread to cover the raw edge of your hem, you actually have to work from the right side of the fabric. So when I'm hemming one of my knit t-shirts, for example, I'm working from the right side of the work, and basically I'm flying blind as I make my hem. There are hem guides that will help you to achieve an even hem. Some people like to fold up a hem and secure it with hem tape, fusible hem tape. Honestly, I found that the quickest and easiest way for me to do it is to pin up an inch deep hem all the way around. And I use pins instead of clips because there's no knife, so I don't have to worry about the knife hitting a pin. So I pin up an inch deep hem all the way around, and I use my right index finger to feel as I feed the garment through the machine. I use my right index finger to feel where the edge of the hem is. I've had excellent results using that method, and my hems look really nice. I'm happy with them. After you've mastered hemming with the Coverstitch machine, you might want to move on to using the binding attachment. I have a binding attachment I have 3 binding attachments for my Janome machines. The reason I have 3 of them is because they come in different sizes depending on what width of binding you want to put on. They also come in double fold or single fold, and that's just a matter of how many layers of fabric enclose the edge of the garment. So again, I'm going to suggest that if you're curious about what binding looks like when it's done with a Coverstitch machine, probably the best place to look is the kids department at Walmart or a department store. Any place that has onesies or little t-shirts for kids, look at the binding on the edges of the onesies and you will see something that looks like twin needle stitching on the front with a piece of fabric that's layered and folded over, and then a cover stitch hem on the reverse. You might also see this in athletic wear or in swimwear. What you need to achieve this look is a binding attachment that sits on the bed of your machine and folds the piece of binding as it comes through a tube and attaches it to the edge of your garment, all in one fell swoop. It's very slick. I've experimented with it a little bit, enough to know that it works on my machine, but I haven't yet tried it on a garment. So you've used your Coverstitch machine to hem. You've used it to attach binding. What other things can you do with your Coverstitch machine? Just like a serger, Coverstitch machines can be used for decorative stitching, and that's the class that I'm teaching next month, and that is the class for which I have been making up class samples this week. The way you would use a Coverstitch machine for decorative techniques varies depending on what look you're trying to achieve. Let's start out with that chain stitch. So if you remember when I was talking about my Juki 5-thread serger and I suggested you look at the inside of your jeans, what you'll see is a line of stitching that forms a seam, and it is a chain stitch seam, and it's composed of a needle thread and the chain looper underneath the bed of the machine. Another place that you will often see this type of seam is on dog food bags or chicken feed bags, and you may have been frustrated by attempting to open them because if you don't pull from the right end, it won't unzip. But if you happen to get lucky and you pull from the correct end, what happens is that stitch unzips and the bag opens. The chain stitch on dog food bags or chicken feed bags is exactly the same chain stitch that my Coverstitch machine makes. And all I have to do is make sure that there is one needle inserted in the machine and that the looper is also threaded. Again, as with the hem, all of the action is happening on the reverse side of the fabric. It's happening on the wrong side of the fabric, but in this case, wrong and right are relative because it just depends on which side of the fabric you want the decorative stitching to appear on. So on the upper side of the fabric, the stitch looks just like a plain old sewing stitch, and indeed you can use a chain stitch to sew things together. You can use a chain stitch to baste things together, because if you baste something together and decide that you don't like the way that it fits, you can unzip the chain and the pieces will magically fall apart. The key to unzipping the chain is to start at the end where you finished the seam. So locate the end where you finished the seam and pull the needle thread to one side of the fabric and hold the looper thread on the other side of the fabric and pull, and the stitch should unzip. Removing a cover stitch hem can be done exactly the same way. The only difference is that on a cover stitch hem, you'll have two or three needle threads, and you'll want to pull them to the front side of the fabric and hold on to them. And then you should be able to pull the looper thread from the wrong side of the fabric and unzip the cover stitch hem. But again, you need to work from the end where you stopped sewing. I'm going to stop for a moment and talk about needles for the cover stitch machine. I really should have done this at the beginning, but you will get the information now. Needles for cover stitch machines are special. You will often see on a cover stitch machine the admonition either on the face of the machine, there might be a sticker, or in the manual that says use only ELX 705 needles. So ELX 705 needles are needles that were actually designed for Elna sergers. They have a groove down the front and down the back of the needle. And if you were to look at a typical sewing machine needle or even a serger needle, those needles only have one groove, usually down the front of the needle. ELX 705 needles have a groove on the front and the back of the needle. And the reason is because that extra groove helps to make a proper cover stitch. If you were to look at the Schmetz website, and I use Schmetz needles almost exclusively, the Schmetz website, their page for the ELX 705 needles indicates that that needle also has a reinforced blade and a slightly rounded tip. There are actually two versions of the ELX 705 needle. There's an ELX 705 and there is an ELX 705 SUK. The SUK designation means that ELX 705 needle is designed for knit fabrics. And I think this may be another place where the early Janome cover stitch machines kind of fell down, because you can do both wovens and knits on cover stitch machines. And I don't remember seeing the SUK needles until about 2 or 3 years ago. The ELX 705 needles do work fine on knits, but I found that I get even better results when I use the ELX 705 SUK needles. And they come in, typically for a cover stitch machine, you will be using either an 8012 or a 9014. We've talked a bit about needles, and now I want to talk a little bit about thread. Cover stitch machines use the same thread that your serger does. It can use regular serger thread. It could use woolly nylon. Some people like to use woolly nylon in the looper because it's a little less irritating against your skin. Typically, you're only going to be using serger thread in the needles, but you can get decorative effects by changing up the thread in the looper. And that's what I want to talk about now. So if you were to use a decorative thread, let's say a 12-weight thread or even an 8-weight pearl cotton in the looper, you can get some really interesting effects. Let's start with that chain stitch where we've only got one needle and the looper. So we have regular serger thread in the needle, and we've got, let's say, 12-weight Wonderful Spaghetti, which is a 12-weight 100% cotton thread. Let's put the spaghetti in the looper and do some chain stitching with those two threads. What you'll get, and remember it's going to be on the underside of the fabric as it goes through the machine, is what looks sort of like a textured kind of crochet type stitch, chain stitch, using the spaghetti thread. It's going to provide some interesting surface decoration. So this is a great way. I've done this with variegated 12-weight thread. It just makes a really nice decorative raised stitch on the surface of the fabric. While you're in chain stitch mode, you can also gather, and you would do that by lengthening your stitch to the maximum length and bumping up your differential to the maximum setting. So on my Coverstitch machine, my maximum stitch length is 4 and my maximum differential is 2. And when I set those, put those settings on my machine and do a chain stitch, and I would probably switch back to regular serger thread in the looper for this, but I can get my Coverstitch machine to gather. So imagine you have a 2.5-inch wide strip of fabric. Let's say you've got some leftover jelly roll strips. If you were to sew a chain stitch down the center of that jelly roll strip and you're sewing lengthwise, that jelly roll strip would gather into a ruffle. I've done this where I've finished the long edges of the jelly roll strip with a rolled hem and then taken that strip to the Coverstitch machine, gathered it with a chain stitch down the center, and then attached it to another piece of fabric. And my favorite way to attach it to another piece of fabric is to pin the ruffle onto the base fabric and then lay a 1/4-inch ribbon or a 3/8 inch ribbon over the chain stitch to hide it and do a cover stitch over the ribbon. So what I'm doing is simultaneously attaching the ruffle to the base fabric, hiding the chain stitch, and adding a decorative ribbon on top of the ruffle. Let's say I want to do some decorative stitching now with more than one needle in the Coverstitch machine. Typically, if a Coverstitch machine has several needle positions, on the Bernina L890 and on my Janome, and I think on most of them nowadays, you have 3 needle positions, so you have left, right, and center. And your needles can be put in any combination, so you could do left and right, you could do left and center, you could do center and right. Or if you wanted to use all 3 of them, you could do left, center, and right and use all 3 needles. For sake of this first example, let's say that we're using the left needle and the right needle. So we've got the widest possible cover stitch. There is no needle in the center position. We have the left needle, the right needle, and the looper. And let's say we're going to put our 12-weight thread back in the looper. So again, remember that the decorative stitching is going to be underneath and you won't be able to see it from where you're sitting. What you're going to see as you work is 2 parallel lines of stitching that look like twin needle stitching on a sewing machine. It's only when you get to the end of the seam or the end of the piece of work that you'll be able to turn it over and see the decorative looper thread going back and forth between the 2 needle threads. Gail Yellen, who is a great serger teacher, she's got a YouTube channel. I highly recommend her. She has done some really interesting things with cover stitch decorative stitches, and she has one that she calls a stacked cover stitch. So if you can imagine, you're going to do your first pass with the right and left needles in to make the widest cover stitch. And then you're going to move one of the needles either to the center position, so you'll have left and center, or you'll have center and right. You're going to do a second pass and probably change the 12-weight thread to a different color to make it show up better. You're going to do a different pass over that same line of stitching, but the second pass is going to be a narrower cover stitch because you're using the left and center or the center and right. And it's going to nestle in between the two outside threads of your first pass. And that way you will get another line of stitching on top of the first line of stitching. That's why she calls it a stacked cover stitch. And then if you want to add a third pass, do a third pass, you could do a chain stitch in the middle with even a third color and get even more decorative textural effects with the 3 different threads. This is hard to explain without visuals, but I hope that you get what I'm aiming at here. Another thing that you can do with your decorative thread is zipper insertions. And you might be asking yourself, well, why would I want to do a zipper on a cover stitch machine? Well, just for the decorative effects, you can get some interesting effects. So let's imagine the first variation that you could do would be to fold over an edge on your fabric, say fold in 1/2 inch and press it so that you get a nice folded edge there. And then maybe use some double-sided tape to attach it to the zipper securely. Then sew along the zipper from the right side of the fabric using a triple cover stitch. So you would have 3 needles and 3 threads. And in this case, you wouldn't be using a decorative thread because you wouldn't be able to see it. You're working from the outside of the piece. So you would want to have regular serger thread in the looper. And when you're finished, what you'll have is 3 parallel lines of stitching right next to the zipper. If you did it in a contrasting thread, you would have a decorative edging along your zipper. If you did it in the same color thread or a coordinating thread, what you would have is something that doesn't show up as much, but because you've got 3 lines of stitching there, it's going to be extremely secure. The second variation is a little bit trickier because, again, you're working from the right side of the or the wrong side of the fabric in this case, because you want the looper stitch to appear on the right side of the fabric. So you'll be working upside down and working blind. And this is one instance where you probably would want to put a decorative 12-weight thread in the looper because you want the decorative looper thread and the decorative looper stitch to be an accent along the side of the zipper. It takes a little bit of practice. You sometimes have to tweak the zipper pull out of the way as you're working, but it does result in a pretty neat effect. What about activewear? We've talked a little bit about using a binding attachment to attach binding to activewear, but you can also do a fake flat felled seam where you, let's say, go to your sewing machine and you sew a seam. You wouldn't want to do this on your serger necessarily, but on a sewing machine. If you sew the seam and then grade the seam so that one side of the seam is, let's say, 1/4 inch and the other side is 1/8 inch. And then you fold the 1/4 inch side over the 1/8 inch side. And you don't, on a flat felled seam on a sewing machine, you'd be folding the upper piece of fabric so that it enclosed the lower piece of fabric in the seam. On this one, you don't have to do that. You can just fold it to the side so that the wider piece is over the narrower piece of the seam. And then you would do a cover stitch on the raw edge of the wider piece. Again, you'd be working you're working blind. You'd kind of have to experiment a little bit and feel it. But what will happen is you can get that looper thread to cover the raw edge of the seam, and it looks like the kind of cover stitching that you would see on activewear. I actually just picked up a New Look pattern, New Look 6771, I think is the number, and it's a sweatshirt and pants pattern, and the sweatshirt has panels in it. It could be color blocked, it could be all done in one color, but I think that those seams where the panels meet would be a great place to try that fake flat felled seam. I mentioned that my Janome Cover Pro 3000 is capable of doing a top cover stitch, which is also seen a lot in athletic wear, and that's where you've got the looper on both the top and the bottom of the seam. So whereas on a traditional cover stitch hem, you've got plain stitching on one side and the looper going back and forth on the other side, apparently on the top cover hem or top cover stitch, you can get the decorative looper look on both sides of the fabric. And I haven't tried that one yet, but I probably will soon. There's a bit of confusion regarding some of these terms because what we would call a flat lock stitch is not necessarily the same thing as an industrial flat lock stitch. And I think the same might be true for the top cover hem, but we'll find out when I start experimenting with it. So cover stitch machines are really versatile. When I bought mine, I thought I was buying a machine that was a one-trick pony and it was only going to hem my knit tops. But as I've played with it and learned more about it, I've discovered that it can do all of these decorative stitches, and no doubt people will continue to come up with new and fun ways to use cover stitch machines. Do you need one? I guess that depends. If you're running a business or you do alterations, you probably are going to find a lot of uses for a cover stitch machine. I used my cover stitch machine a few weeks ago to hem a bridesmaid's dress for a friend of mine at church. If you don't make a lot of knit tops, maybe just doing a twin needle hem on your sewing machine is perfectly fine and you're happy with that, and that's terrific. Not everybody needs to be a machine junkie like me. I often say about my husband that he's never met a tool that he didn't like, and I suppose I'm just as bad when it comes to sewing machines. If you're thinking about getting a cover stitch machine, or maybe you weren't thinking about getting a cover stitch machine until you listened to this podcast, and now you are, I hope that some of this information has been valuable. Please feel free to email me. There's a contact form at my website, janetzabo.com. I'm hoping to get some interview shows up here before too long. As much as I love talking, I'm thinking that people probably are going to get tired of listening to me pontificate for half an hour. So I would like to bring some other people in and hear what they have to say. I've got a few people on the list. It's just a matter of timing and getting together with people to record a podcast interview. But as soon as I can get some of those done, I'll be sprinkling those in between some of the episodes. Now that the podcast is up on iTunes, I would love it if somebody would go and give a review. It would help other people to find the podcast, and feel free to share it with your friends. You can go read the show notes at thestraightstitchpodcast.com. There are show notes for every episode, and you can leave comments and questions on the website as well if you don't want to email me. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week, and I hope you get to go sew something.